I would like to give a warm welcome to Elizabeth Kahn Kaplan. She is an educator, a writer, and a lecturer. And among many professional accomplishments, Elizabeth wrote curriculum guides for the Musical Theater Project for the New York Historical Society in Manhattan. She has co-edited a book on the 19th century artist William Sidney Mount for the Three Village Historical Society in Suffolk County, New York. And she has curated the society's current exhibit, Spies, How the Long Island Spy Ring Helped George Washington Win the Revolution. She's also writing a teacher's guide on this subject for Stony Brook University. She was a speaker in the humanities for the New York Council for Humanities for 10 years, and she currently offers many wonderful programs as an independent historian, including on Votes for Women, The Long Hard Road to the 19th Amendment, and Women and Men Who Got Us There, America's 8 First Ladies from New York State, The First Ladies of Long Island, Fact or Fiction, The Truth About George Washington's Culper Spy Ring, Washington Crossing the Delaware, The Story Behind the Painting, Poking Fun, Political Puns and Social Satire in the Paintings of William Sidney Mount, and this evening's topic, My Betsey, the Remarkable Wife of Alexander Hamilton. As a member of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, Elizabeth has presented the program you're about to hear at Hamilton Grange National Memorial, our partner, home of Eliza and Alexander Hamilton in Upper Manhattan, and at multiple libraries and historical societies, both in person and via Zoom.
It's a pleasure to speak with all of you, wonderful historians and history lovers. And I thank Nicole and all of you at the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society for inviting me. So here we have our husband and wife, Eliza on the left and Alexander on the right. And it is amazing that these people ever met and ever married because of where they were born and the circumstances in which they were born. And you probably know that they were born miles and miles apart, he in the Caribbean, she in Upper New York State, and from very different backgrounds. Next, please. Her father, Philip Schuyler, was quite distinguished, a member of New York's landed gentry, a general in the French and Indian War and in the American Revolution, and later became a U.S. Senator from New York when we became a nation. Next, please. And his beautiful wife, Catherine Van Rensselaer Schuyler, daughter of a landed aristocrat. Now, they had 16,000 acres near what's Albany today, descended from the first Dutch settler of Van Rensselaerwyck near Albany. Quote, a lady of great beauty, shape, and gentility. Philip Schuyler married her in 1755, and she was 4 months pregnant at the time with their first child, Angelica, but that was not unusual in those days, and maybe not so unusual now either. Of their 15 children, 8 survived to adulthood. Again, that was not unusual in the 17th and 18th centuries. But their daughter, Eliza, who had 8 children, fought her whole life to keep them all alive and succeeded, with the exception of one. Next slide, please. So this is from the musical Hamilton, which I assume many of you have seen, either the play or the movie or read the book with all the lyrics. These are the Schuyler sisters, and we see Angelica in pink and lovely Betsey or Eliza or Elizabeth in green and sister Peggy, Margarita, in yellow. Next, please. They never did get into Manhattan to find husbands, as the play Hamilton indicates. They never danced around in New York City. No, they stayed in Albany, and they lived at the Schuyler Mansion in New York, constructed 1761 to 65. So they were 4, 5, and 6 years old when they moved into this. The family called it the Pastures. Next, please. And of course, this is the Schuyler Mansion today. It's a museum. I visited it. I hope you will too. Albany's a fascinating city in and of itself, but I did have an excellent tour at the home of the Schuyler Mansion. Next, please. So who was the father of her future husband, Alexander? We just heard that Eliza was a really aristocratic background. If we ever had aristocrats in New York, they were them. And Alexander's background is quite different. His father, James, was descended from a laird, a lord, born in Ayrshire, Scotland. He was the fourth son of Laird Alexander Hamilton of Grange. He moved to the West Indies to become a merchant on the island of St. Kitts. Now, why did he have to move? You know about English primogeniture, where the first son gets everything, and the second and third sons are encouraged to go into the military or to go into I won't say the priesthood, I will say the religious life. And then the fourth son and any sons after that, they're to fend for themselves. Now, we might think of St. Kitts as a little island lost in the middle of the sea, as Lin-Manuel Miranda's lyrics attributed it to a little spot. No, it was quite important in the 18th century as a trading center. All of the islands that became part of the Virgin Islands and the British Islands, there was a lot of commerce going on there, and many plantations with wealthy people growing either cotton or sugar. This is the coat of arms, as you see here. So he was descended from a noble family. Next slide, please. His mother is another story, because the play Hamilton opens with accusing her of being a whore. And that has always bothered me because she was anything but. And I'm going to take a little time, if you don't mind, from Eliza to talk about Hamilton's mother, because I think it's time to set the record straight. Rachel, and it was spelled Raquel, and I'm not sure how it was pronounced, but we'll call her Rachel, was born on the British island of Nevis in the West Indies, a daughter of John Fawcett IV, a physician, a trader, or planter of French Huguenot ancestry, and his English wife, Mary Uppingham. So she's part French and part English. In 1745, Rachel's father died, and Rachel was brought by her mother to the Danish-owned island of St. Croix. That's going to be significant that it was Danish-owned, to visit her mother's sister and brother-in-law, Anne and James Lytton, who owned a sugar plantation. Mary Fawcett quickly arranged Rachel's unwilling marriage in St. Croix to Johann Michael Lavienne, owner of a 75-acre cotton plantation. It turned out that he wasn't at all wealthy, and I'm sure that they were all disappointed to find that out. Married to a much older, abusive man, she left her husband and their son, Peter Lavienne, after 5 years and went to St. Kitts, where she met and fell in love with James Hamilton. Next. I just showed you this little map to show that St. Kitts on the, St. Croix on the left and St. Kitts and Nevis on the right, 134 nautical miles apart. So a doable trip. But please do remember, St. Croix is Danish and St. Kitts and Nevis are owned by Great Britain, and they have different laws that apply. Next, please. Their two sons, James, Alexander's older brother, and Alexander, were born on Nevis. Lavienne finally granted Rachel a divorce in St. Croix. She'd been trying to get one for many years. Under Danish law, he could remarry, but she could not. Rachel lived with James as man and wife for 15 years, and I would call that a common law marriage. Next, please. This is the Hamilton home in Charlestown, Nevis, rebuilt from the home of the house where Alexander Hamilton lived as a young child. Nevis is a wonderful place to visit, a beautiful place, and they have done all their best to recreate Hamilton's life. The Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society contributed a statue of Hamilton that was unveiled in Nevis fairly recently. Next, please. The family of four moved to St. Croix in 1765. James, never a successful businessman, left the family. We're not sure why. And Rachel opened a small shop to support her sons, and she was quite a clever businesswoman. She was successful in the mercantile business. She died of yellow fever in 1768. Rachel's cousin, Peter Lytton, took in both boys, but committed suicide a year later. The boys were apprenticed. Their father again tried to make his fortune in the Caribbean until he died in 1799. Alexander and he corresponded through the years. They were never estranged. He was never estranged from his half-brother, Peter Lavienne, who moved to the United States and died in South Carolina before Hamilton did. Next, please. So here's Hamilton in his youth. He was a clerk in his mother's shop, later at the Christiansted St. Croix import-export establishment of David Beekman and Nicholas Kruger. Hamilton became skilled in finance, trade, accounting, and economics. Next. There was a geological event, a hurricane of level 5 proportions, 160-mile-an-hour winds, devastated not only St. Croix and Nevis, but many of the islands. It was one of the worst hurricanes ever experienced in the Caribbean. And Alexander wrote a letter to his father, James, describing the anguish and the turmoil and the deaths and the destruction. And it was quite a long letter because he was never brief. And a minister on the island, Hugh Knox, pardon me, convinced Alexander to let him publish it in the Royal Danish American Gazette, which was a newspaper on St. Croix, but which was widely read in the United States as well. And well, there weren't the states then, forgive me, in the colonies as well. It was published in Massachusetts as well. Many people credit that hurricane for encouraging people on Nevis and St. Kitts and so forth, St. Croix, to collect money to send this brilliant young man who could write such a marvelous letter to the states, the colonies, to be educated. He wanted to be a doctor. He thought he would study medicine. And although many people attribute the hurricane to the impetus, research done by Michael Newton and others indicate that he was probably ready to go there even before the hurricane, and money was being collected. Next slide, please. Alexander's first cousin, Anne Lytton Venton, a daughter of Rachel's sister in St. Croix, was a primary contributor to his trip to America and to his subsequent education there. He was always grateful to her, as we'll see at the end of his life. Next slide, please. He went to Elizabethtown Academy in New Jersey, hoping to go to Princeton after a year of study at Elizabethtown, but Princeton would not allow him to accelerate at a rapid rate, which he wished to do. And so he went to King's College in New York City, which was located not at the present campus, Columbia University now, but in Lower Manhattan. A little thing told the American Revolution was about to break out. He started school in 1773, but by 1775, he was fully engaged in fighting for the American patriot cause. Next slide, please. Alexander Hamilton took command of the New York artillery in 1775. He fought at the Battle of Trenton after crossing the Delaware River with General Washington. And a year later, General Washington asked him to serve as on his staff as an aide-de-camp. Eliza and Alexander met briefly in 1778 at the Schuyler home, the pastures, where as aide-de-camp to General Washington, he delivered a letter to her father, General Philip Schuyler. They did not interact at great length that moment, but Alexander did have dinner with Philip Schuyler, and I suspect that that's when Philip Schuyler got a very good impression of what would become his son-in-law. Next slide, please. Now, Eliza is at the age of 22, and in 1770s, it was considered rather old to get married. And she had an aunt, Philip Schuyler's sister Gertrude, who was married to a Dr. Cochrane. And Dr. Cochrane was the surgeon for General Washington, situated in Morristown, New Jersey, which was the winter headquarters at that time, 1779 to 1780. Next slide, please. Eliza was invited by her Aunt Gertrude to come spend the winter with her at their rented home in Morristown, New Jersey. It's now a museum owned by the DAR. You can visit it. The Schuyler Hamilton House is what it's called now. That's when Eliza and Alexander met again and did fall in love. Next slide, please. And this is a scene, of course, from the play Hamilton, with Philippa Sue as Eliza and Lin-Manuel Miranda himself as Hamilton. And it's quite a touching love scene. Next slide, please. He wrote to her before they were married, before they were engaged. I have told you, and I told you truly, that I love you too much. You engross my thoughts too entirely to allow me to think of anything else. You not only employ my mind all day, but you intrude upon my sleep. I meet you in every dream. And I'm going to ask a fairly substantial audience of women here, would that get to you? It would certainly have gotten to me. And it certainly did convince Eliza that Alexander might be the one for her. Next slide, please. Then they became, the question is why? Why did Philip and Catherine Schuyler give their consent to Eliza's marriage to Alexander Hamilton? Think of the negatives. He was an orphan. He was illegitimate according to the law. He was impoverished. He was self-educated, but not brilliantly educated yet, they thought. And he didn't have any financial prospects whatsoever. Why should they hand him their beloved second daughter in marriage? The reason is clear. Next slide, please. Their oldest daughter, Angelica Schuyler, had eloped with John Barker Church, also known as John Carter, in 1777. And by the way, if you've seen the play Hamilton or the movie, Angelica was married and a mother before she even met Alexander Hamilton. Anyway, Catherine Schuyler was a little upset that their daughter had eloped, and she, knowing that Eliza and Hamilton were very much in love, was afraid that they might do the same. They might elope too. Why didn't the Schuylers like her husband, John Barker Church? He was somebody who'd come from England with very poor background of financial misdealings, and he was a man under suspicion, and yet Angelica fell in love with him. Next slide, please. Said Philip Schuyler in a letter, Carter and my eldest daughter ran off and married on the 23rd instance. Unacquainted with his family, his connections and situation in life, the match was exceedingly disagreeable to me, and I had signified it to him. But nonetheless, breaking 18th century etiquette, they went off and got married. Next slide, please. Alexander is now given permission to marry Eliza. They are engaged, and he's again writing letters to her. You are certainly a little sorceress and have bewitched me. I love you more than I ought, more than it is consistent with my peace. But why do you not write to me oftener? It is again an age since I have heard from you. I write you at least 3 letters for your one, although I am immersed in public business and you have nothing to do but to think of me. I'm wondering how she reacted to that. Next slide, please. And then he wrote, my Betsey, but now we're talking of times to come. Tell me, my pretty damsel, have you made up your mind upon the subject of housekeeping? Do you soberly relish the pleasure of being a poor man's wife? Have you learned to think a homespun preferable to a brocade, and the rumbling of a wagon wheel to the musical rattling of a coach and 6? He was always aware that he could provide less for her than she had been used to, and he was afraid that that would be an impediment in their marriage. But Eliza was not one to care about such things. She cared about him and very little about the trappings of a social life. Next slide, please. They were married on in the parlor of the Schuyler Mansion, December 14th, 1780. The mansion looks exactly like that today. It's a photograph I took fairly recently. Please do go and visit. Next slide, please. After she married Hamilton, Martha Washington and she became intimate. Martha was a good source of housewifely advice and of social etiquette in the military. And George Washington really looked upon Hamilton almost as a son. He never had children of his own, as you know, only the adopted children from his stepchildren. So Hamilton was close to Washington and Eliza was close to Martha. Next slide, please. Now, Robert Morris is known as a financier of the Revolution, and Alexander Hamilton, very much interested in finance, decided to write a 31-page letter to him, giving his outline for what the economic future of the United States, the future United States should be. By now, it's 1781, and it looks as though we may become a nation. We may earn our independence, although Yorktown hasn't happened yet. But he's often running as a future Secretary of the Treasury, although he didn't realize it at that time. And Eliza helped him. She copied the letters for him, etc. Next slide, please. Now, Alexander, of course, was working for George Washington as an aide-de-camp, finally convinced him to let him go to battle. He wanted to go to Yorktown, which would be the culminating battle of the Revolution. Elizabeth was 5 months pregnant with her first child. In August, he wrote to her, our operations must be over by the later end of October, and I will fly to the arms of my Betsey. He predicted that the battle would succeed by the end of October, and he was right. On October 19th, the British under Cornwallis surrendered. Next slide, please. And here are some of the children. There'll be more. The first son, Philip Hamilton, was born January 22nd, 1782. And 2.5 years later, his sister, is it 2.5 or 1.5? My math. Our first daughter, Angelica Hamilton, named after Eliza's beloved sister. These two were very close, not only in age, but as they grew up. And Angelica became extremely dependent on her brother, Philip, which will lead to some tragedy. Next slide, please. Another child born, second son, third child, Alexander Hamilton. By now, it's May of '86. We are a nation. Hamilton is working hard writing the Federalist Papers and working with the group that is trying to get the Constitution passed. Meanwhile, in 1787, Eliza and Alexander took in Fanny Antill, the motherless daughter of one of Hamilton's army friends, Colonel Edward Antill. Her mother had died. Hamilton took her in, and when she was 4, her father died. Now she's an orphan. Eliza and Hamilton raised her as their own for 10 years, until her older sister married and took her back into their family. So now Eliza has 4 children of her own, plus an adopted little girl. Next slide, please. This famous portrait was made by a man in prison, Ralph Earl, a wonderful 18th century artist. In those days, if you became indebted, there was no such thing as bankruptcy declarations and giving your creditors whatever you could and getting away with that. No, you went to debtor's prison. So Ralph Earl happened to be in debtor's prison in New York from September 1786 until January 1788. A long time. Now, the family and friends of the artist decided to raise money for him, and the Relief of Distressed Debtors and the Society of the Cincinnati came in to sit for him. If they could, gave him money, but also asked their family and friends to come in and have their portrait painted in prison so that they could pay him and his debts would be paid. Eliza in this portrait is 4 months pregnant. She showed up at the prison every day for 7 weeks to be painted by him and then, of course, paid for the portrait. Next slide, please. Talking about the Society of the Cincinnati, it's a hereditary organization. Hereditary members are qualified male descendants of commissioned officers who served in the Continental Army or Navy and their French counterparts. And we should never forget the French really helped us win the revolution. Next slide, please. So now their third son, their fourth child, James Alexander Hamilton, is born in 1788. Meantime, the next slide, please. Alexander Hamilton, of course, is now living in New York City, which is the first capital of the new United States. Eliza is the hostess here in Manhattan. Next slide, please. Her husband, Secretary of the Treasury. After Alexander became Treasury Secretary in 1789, Eliza's social duties in New York City only increased. Mrs. Hamilton, Mrs. Sarah J., and Mrs. Lucy Knox were the leaders of official society, an early historian wrote. In addition, she managed their household of 5 children. James McHenry of Maryland fame, the Fort McHenry was named for him, was noted to Alexander, and Eliza had as much merit as your treasurer, as you have as treasurer of the United States. They never had much money. And it's interesting that although he was a financial wizard and helped many people, and certainly our country, he never acquired a great fortune of his own. They never owned a home of their own until they built the Grange in 1802. Other than that, it was rented homes or living with family. Next slide, please. Now, in the summer of 1791, by then, the U.S. Capitol has now moved to Philadelphia. Eliza visited her parents in Albany with the 5 children to keep them safe from yellow fever, which was rampant in Philadelphia. Alexander remained in Philadelphia as Secretary of the Treasury. And there was a knock at the door of his house, and entered 23-year-old pretty Maria Reynolds. And we're going to take a little time to explain what happened there, because it does impact on Eliza's life. Next slide, please. Maria requested his help to get money so that she could return to New York. She was claiming that her husband, James, had abandoned her. Hamilton did not have any money on his possession at that time at his home, and so he retrieved her address in order to deliver the money to her later. Upon arriving at the boarding house where Maria was lodging, she brought him upstairs and led him into her bedroom. He later recounted that, quote, some conversation ensued from which it was quickly apparent that other than pecuniary compensation would be acceptable, unquote. Eliza and the children returned from Albany to Philadelphia in the fall of 1791. In November, Betsey became pregnant. Alexander tried to end the affair with Maria Reynolds. Next slide. Over a period of months, Hamilton paid blackmail money to James Reynolds, over $1,300 of money to maintain secrecy, and he ended the affair in June of 1792. $1,300 was a huge amount of money in those days. Next slide, please. On the 4th son, the 5th child, John Church Hamilton, was born in 1792. Next slide, please. James Reynolds had participated in a scheme involving unpaid back wages intended for Revolutionary War veterans. In other words, he's stealing from veterans. This is the husband of Maria. In November 1792, he was jailed. Reynolds used his knowledge about Hamilton's affair with his wife to bargain his way out of his own troubles, threatening to name Hamilton as originator of the financial scheme. Next slide, please. Reynolds knew Hamilton would have to choose between revealing his affair with Maria or falsely admitting complicity to the charges, or pay Reynolds more hush money. Rumors were circulating in Philadelphia by then by Hamilton's political foes, and there were several, not of the affair, but of Hamilton's possible connection to the scheme of cheating Revolutionary War veterans of their back pay. Next slide, please. Here is James Monroe. He's a senator from Virginia. He'll be president a decade or so later. No, 2 decades later. Next slide, please. Senator James Monroe and Speaker of the House, Frederick Muhlenberg, and Congressman Abraham Venable heard of this possible corruption within the nation's new government, the scheme of cheating veterans of money. On December 15, 1792, they confronted Hamilton with the information they had received, supported by the notes of Hamilton's payments to Reynolds that Maria had given them to corroborate her husband's accusations. Maria was a piece of work. And by the way, in the play Hamilton, the musical has Jefferson, Madison, and Burr as the three who confronted Hamilton. Of course, that made for better audience participation because we all know those names. None of us knew the names of Speaker Muhlenberg. Well, maybe some of you did, or Congressman Abraham Venable. We might have heard of James Monroe. Fortunately, we did. But still, Jefferson, Madison, and Burr had more sex appeal. Next slide, please. Denying any financial improprieties, Hamilton revealed the true nature of his relationship with Maria Reynolds and her husband in all its unsavory details. He even turned over the letters from both Maria and James Reynolds. Oh, Alexander, what were you thinking? Of course, the three men, being married men most probably, yes, they were, understood perfectly well that married men sometimes cheated on their wives. I know this is information for all of you that may not be welcome, and I apologize for that, but it tends to be the truth. Some married men do cheat on their wives. And these three married men, Monroe, Muhlenberg, and Venable, understood completely. Next slide, please. Now that was 1792. Apparently convinced that Hamilton was not guilty of the charge of public misconduct, Monroe agreed not to make public the information and documents on the Reynolds affair. Monroe and his colleagues assured Hamilton the matter was settled. Something between you and your wife, Hamilton, has nothing to do with us or the government. Next slide, please. Monroe, however, did send the letters to a close personal friend. Next, to see who that might be, Thomas Jefferson. He was Vice President of the United States. In 1797, 5 years after receiving the letters from James Monroe, Jefferson used the knowledge to start rumors about Hamilton's private life. Jefferson and Hamilton were self-described nemesis. Next slide, please. Why is that so? Jefferson, the Democratic Republican Party, Hamilton, the Federalist Party. Jefferson's beliefs: a smaller government, states' power, against the central bank that Hamilton wanted to build, pastoral idea of small farms for this country, Southern landowners was his supporters, and he was pro-French interests. The French and the British were warring back and forth. He was on the side of the French. Hamilton of the Federalist Party. He believed in larger central government. He believed in federal power. He believed in favoring a central bank to help with the currency of this country. He looked to cities as commercial centers. He founded Paterson, New Jersey, with the waterfall there. And East Coast merchants were on his side, and he was pro-British. So Jefferson and Hamilton were not good friends. Next slide, please. In July of 1797, 5 years after the letters were given to Monroe, the Reynolds affair came to light. In order to curb the influence of Alexander Hamilton against the policies of Thomas Jefferson, a Jefferson supporter and journalist, James Callender, and you're allowed to boo here if you wish, published in his book, The History of the United States for 1796, a report of the affair between Alexander Hamilton and Maria Reynolds. Eliza was 8 months pregnant when the story became public knowledge. Next slide, please. Fifth son and sixth child, William Stephen Hamilton, born August 4th, 1797, 3 weeks after the publication of the book by calendar. Next slide, please. On August 25th, 3 weeks after she gave birth, Hamilton responded to Calendar's revelation by printing his own 95-page pamphlet, he was never brief, called Observations on Certain Documents, later known as the Reynolds pamphlet, in which he denied all charges of corruption dealing with veterans' pay. Next slide. But in doing so, he said it was only a matter of the affair that caused him to pay money to Reynolds. He didn't pay James Reynolds money to shush him up about the financial scandal, but for the personal scandal. And this was his observations, and it went on, charges of a speculation against Alexander Hamilton, perfectly denied by himself. 95 pages worth. Next slide, please. Their confession, this is what he wrote. This confession is not made without a blush. I can never cease to condemn myself for the pain which it may inflict in a bosom eminently entitled to all my gratitude, fidelity, and love. We all know whose bosom that was. But that bosom will approve that even at so great an expense, I should effectually wipe away a more serious stain. My defense against a more heinous charge could alone have extorted from me so painful an indecorum. Next slide, please. Their second daughter and seventh child was born in 1799, so she must have forgiven him. Next slide, please. There were 6 more causes of grief for Eliza. Next, please. Number 1, in March of 1801, Eliza's beloved younger sister, Margarita, known as Peggy, Schuyler Van Rensselaer, wife of Stephen Van Rensselaer III, died at age 42. Let me just take a moment to tell you that Stephen Van Rensselaer III was the wealthiest man in the colonies and in the United States. He died at a young age, and she also. And that just tells you, in those days, no matter how much money you have, the doctors really didn't know how to treat you. She died of a cold. Next slide, please. On July 4th, 1801, a New York lawyer named George Eaker gave an Independence Day speech favorable to Jefferson and others who were opposed to the views of Hamilton. 4 months after this July 4th speech, 19-year-old Philip Hamilton and a friend went to see a play at the Park Theater in Manhattan. Upon arrival, Philip saw Eaker and confronted him about the speech he'd given in a hostile verbal encounter that led to a disturbance in the theater. Eaker eventually muttered that Philip and his friend were rascals, a term which then held a strongly dishonorable connection, causing the two to challenge Eaker to a duel. It was Philip and his friend who instigated the duel. Acquaintances wrote that Alexander Hamilton counseled his son, telling him to throw away his first shot. Why? Hamilton was an exceedingly religious man, as Eliza was, and believed that the greatest crime one could commit was to kill another human being. Yes, Philip, you must fight the duel to defend your honor. Honor was uppermost in Hamilton's mind always, but you don't have to kill him. Fire into the air first, and then your opponent may decide to forgive you. Next slide, please. November 23rd, 1801, Philip was fatally wounded by a duel in Weehawken, New Jersey. He died the next day, his parents at his bedside. Philip died in the duel after throwing away his first shot, as did Alexander himself less than 3 years after his son died, and in the same place and with the same pistol. Next slide, please. Never did I see a man so completely overwhelmed with grief as Hamilton said, Gouverneur Morris. Next slide, please. Gouverneur is not, he was not a governor. It's a family name, a family first name. He was a friend of George Washington, a delegate, etc., minister to France, and the closest friend of Alexander Hamilton. Next slide, please. His peg leg, by the way, you want to go back for a second. Let's take a look at that lovely peg leg of Gouverneur Morris. It's in the New York Historical Society on display, and you might enjoy looking at it. Next slide, please. Third cause of grief. Angelica Hamilton, 17, suffered a nervous breakdown at the loss of her beloved older brother. She never recovered. They were the closest of siblings. Next slide, please. Only intermittently lucid, consigned to an eternal childhood. She often did not recognize family members. For the rest of her life, she sang songs that she had played on the piano in duets with her father. And she always talked of her dead brother as if he were still alive. In her will, Eliza entreated her children to be, quote, kind, affectionate, and attentive to my said unfortunate daughter, Angelica, unquote. In 1856, Angelica's younger sister, Eliza, contemplating Angelica's expected death, wrote, "Poor sister, what a happy release will be hers, lost to life for a lifetime." Next slide, please. The Grange was a house that they finally, Eliza and Alexander finally got around to building for themselves. They did it after these terrible causes of grief and went on with their lives. The Grange, the Sweet project, was built in 1802 as a summer residence in northern Manhattan, 141st Street, actually. Next slide, please. And their sixth son and eighth child, Philip, or known as Little Phil, was born in 1802, named after his older brother who died in the duel. Next slide, please. The fourth cause of grief for Eliza, her mother, Catherine Van Rensselaer Schuyler, died suddenly at age 69 of a stroke in March 1803. Next slide, please. Now, Aaron Burr is going to be a cause of grief, but let's take a look at him now. Third Vice President of the United States while Thomas Jefferson was president. Next slide. He ran for governor of New York State in 1804 and lost his race. He blamed it on a personal smear campaign believed to have been orchestrated by his party's rivals, including Alexander Hamilton. The Albany Register, a newspaper, published a letter written which relayed Hamilton's judgment that Burr was a dangerous man and one who ought not be trusted with the reins of government. Now, it wasn't Hamilton himself who wrote that. He was being quoted by somebody who went to a dinner party where Hamilton was present and presumably said something of the kind. And he was claiming to know of a still more despicable opinion which General Hamilton has expressed of Mr. Burr. Again, this was a letter written and published in a newspaper, a letter written by somebody who overheard Hamilton, he said, say these things. Hamilton never said them in public and never wrote them. In June, Burr sent the letter to Hamilton seeking an affirmation or disavowal of Hamilton's remarks. Next, please. A series of letters between Hamilton and Burr were exchanged over a period of weeks. Hamilton denied the remarks and asked for proof. The letters escalated in tone. Hamilton would not back down or apologize, believing that his character would be undermined to the public mind from then on. And above all, he and other gentlemen of that time thought that having a good character, meaning a good reputation, was paramount. Next slide, please. Alexander's last letter to Eliza, written on the night before the duel. He must have thought that there was a good chance he would die, and that's why he wrote this. The consolations of religion, my beloved, can alone support you, and these you have a right to enjoy. Fly to the bosom of your God and be comforted. With my last idea.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
That is, unfortunately, folks, I disabled Siri, but she pops up from time to time. With my last idea, I shall cherish the sweet hope of meeting you in a better world. Adieu, best of wives and best of women. Embrace all my darling children for me, ever yours. Best of wives and best of women. Next slide, please. On July 11th, 1804, on the banks of the Hudson River in Weehawken, Burr killed Alexander. The bullet went through his spine, into his liver, and into other organs, and it was beyond hope. He was rowed across the river to the home of a friend. Next slide, please. Hamilton was taken to the home of William Bayard, a close friend. A plaque marks the site, if you're in Manhattan, by the way. 82 Jane Street in Greenwich Village is the place. The house is no longer there. Another house has been built, but the new owners put up the plaque to say that this was the site where Alexander Hamilton died. Next slide, please. Gouverneur Morris went to the sick room where the scene so distressed him that he had to walk in the garden to get control of himself. After that, he sat by his friend's side until Hamilton died. Eliza had been with her husband for the previous 24 hours. The poor woman was almost distracted. She begged Morris to come into her room, burst into tears, told him that he was the best friend her husband had, begged him to join her in prayers for her own death, and then be a father to her own children. Next slide, please. Gouverneur Morris pulled himself together to do right by his friend. He delivered the eulogy at Hamilton's funeral on July 14th at Trinity Church, and then organized a secret subscription among Hamilton's friends to pay off his debts and support his family. Again, he had never made much money for himself, and the Grange, of course, had been an expensive project. Next slide, please. For Eliza Hamilton, a widow at 47, the collapse of her world was total, overwhelming, and remorseless. Within 3 years, she had had to cope with 4 deaths of those close to her: her sister Peggy, her eldest son, her mother, and her husband, not to mention the mental breakdown of her eldest daughter. Her 4 youngest children were 11, 7, 4, and 2. Next slide, please. 2 months after the duel, she spoke of Hamilton as my beloved, valiant husband and my guardian angel. She thought that God, in snatching Hamilton away, had balanced the ledgers of her life, inflicting exquisite pain equal to her matchless joy in her marriage. I have remarked to you that I have had a double share of blessings, and I must now look forward to grief. She pored so frequently over his letters to her that they began to crack and crumble into dust. Around her neck, she wore a tiny bag of cloth containing brittle yellow scraps of the love letters, the sonnets that Hamilton had given to her during their courtship in Morristown. The scraps were sewn together as the paper decomposed, and the intimate farewell letter he had prepared for her on the eve of the duel she wore around her neck in this bag her whole life. Next slide, please. Number 6, cause of grief. Because the news of Hamilton's death further weakened the already precarious health of Philip Schuyler, Eliza went to Albany to nurse her father. Philip Schuyler died at age 71 in November 1804, 4 months after she was widowed. Next slide. After her husband's death, Eliza was left to pay Hamilton's debts of almost $60,000, a huge amount in those days. The Grange was sold at public auction. However, she was later able to repurchase it from Hamilton's executors, who had decided that Eliza could not be publicly dispossessed of her home, and purchased it themselves to sell back to her at half the price. Eliza and her children lived at the Grange for 30 years after that. Next slide, please. And this is what the Grange looked like when I was a student in high school at the High School of Music and Art near 135th Street and Convent Avenue. I used to walk by it every single day from the bus, and it looked like a haunted house to me. It had been abandoned completely, and it was derelict and falling apart. And at Halloween, children did terrible things to it, and it was an unhappy state of affairs. Next slide, please. But a group of people who cared about it got money together and put it in proper shape. And the Grange was relocated to its third site in St. Nicholas Park, 141st Street. September 17th, 2011 is when it opened. I visited there recently. I hope you will. It's a wonderful place and a partner of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society. Next slide, please. Notwithstanding her financial plight, she heeded one sacred injunction in Hamilton's farewell letter to take care of his now blind poor cousin, Anne Lytton Venton Mitchell, the person in the world to whom, as a friend, I am under the greatest obligations, he said. Remember, she contributed a great sum of money to bring him to the colonies. Eliza invited her to stay at the Grange for extended periods and bailed her out with a $630 gift in 1810. Next slide, please. Eliza had forgiven her husband for the Reynolds affair. She would spend the next 50 years trying to undo the damage done to Hamilton's reputation during the last decade of his life, his reputation destroyed by the anti-federalists who then took over in Washington. Next slide, please. In her first decades of widowhood, Eliza had to endure a stream of presidents who had crossed swords with her husband and had no desire to gild his memory. As federalism became a term of abuse, she embarked on a single-minded crusade to do justice to her husband's achievements. Next slide, please. She urged her son, John Church Hamilton, to edit Hamilton's papers and produce a massive history that would truly glorify her husband. Eliza buttonholed elderly politicians, Revolutionary War veterans, peppered them with detailed questionnaires, soliciting their recollections of her husband, which she wrote down. She traveled to Mount Vernon and borrowed letters that Hamilton had written to Washington. She knew that she was racing against the clock, against mortality, against the vanishing trove of mementos of the Revolutionary years. Next slide, please. She, a single mother who by her 40s had delivered 8 children, had been a foster mother to one little girl, and the wife of a man who had been orphaned himself in childhood, Eliza was passionate about the lives of children. Next, please. In 1808, Eliza was one of the founders of the first private orphanage in the city, the New York Orphan Asylum Society. She was indefatigable in her effort to raise money and support the society, becoming its director in 1821. She remained involved until her 90s. The organization she helped to found with Isabella Graham exists today as Graham Wyndham, the oldest nonprofit and non-sectarian child welfare agency in America. Next slide, please. This is a portrait of her by a famous artist, Henry Ingram. She was 68 years old in 1925, still working very hard for the Orphan Society and other things as well. Next slide, please. Here is Philippa Sue, the actress who portrayed Eliza in Hamilton, at the Graham Wyndham site in front of a plaque honoring Elizabeth Hamilton for all she did for the Graham Wyndham Foundation. Next slide, please. And then the group from Hamilton, the play, purchased a portrait of Eliza and gave it to the philanthropy section of the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. I visited there 2 weeks ago, specifically to see that portrait, among other things. She was 73 years old. Next slide, please. In 1818, Eliza, aged 61, returned to the New York State Legislature to win a charter for the Hamilton Free School, the first educational institution in the Washington Heights and Inwood sections of Manhattan. There was not a single school north of 155th Street until then. No tuition was charged. Eliza believed that all children, even poor ones, should be educated, if for no other reason than to possess the ability to read the Bible. She was a deeply religious woman. It stood on land Eliza donated on Broadway between 187th and 188th Streets. Some of you may know that neighborhood in Upper Manhattan, and was established in honor of her husband's memory. Next slide, please. The Inwood branch of the New York Public Library initially was a circulating collection kept afloat by the endowment from Eliza. Next slide, please. In November 1833, at the age of 78, Eliza resold the Grange for $25,000, funding the purchase of a New York townhouse, now called the Hamilton Holly House. She lived there for 9 years with two of her married children, Alexander Hamilton Jr., Eliza Hamilton Holly, and their spouses. Next slide, please. And there's an image of the Hamilton Holly House in 2010. It's still there. There's a boutique on the ground floor. It's at 4 St. Mark's Place between 2nd and 3rd Avenues in Manhattan, and I recommend strongly that you go there. In 2004, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission designated it as a landmark. Wonderful memory of Eliza. Now there's sublime retribution coming toward Eliza. Next slide, please. After James Monroe was no longer president, so that would have been in the 1820s, he paid a call on Mrs. Hamilton while she was visiting her daughter in Washington, D.C. Eliza was in her garden talking with her 15-year-old nephew when a servant approached bearing a card with Monroe's name. On seeing the card, Mrs. Hamilton, much perturbed, said in a low, angry voice, "What has that man come to see me for?" Next slide, please. Her nephew followed her back into the house, and Monroe rose as they entered the parlor. She remained standing and did not ask him to sit down, which was an insult if you really wanted somebody to come to your home. It was a clue that you weren't welcome. He bowed and addressed her formally in a kind of set speech he had prepared, that it was many years once they had met, since they had met, that the lapse of time had brought no softening influence, that they were both nearing the grave when past differences could be forgiven and forgotten. Next slide, please. She answered, still standing and looking at him, "Mr. Monroe, if you have come to tell me that you repent, that you are very sorry for the slanders you circulated against my dear husband, I understand it. But otherwise, no lapse of time, no nearness to the grave makes any difference." Monroe bowed, turned, and left. Now, there was a woman named Eliza Bowen Jumel. You may have visited Jumel Mansion, her home in Upper Manhattan, the oldest home in Manhattan still standing. She married Aaron Burr, or rather, he married her. The marriage lasted 4 months. Alexander Hamilton Jr., her divorce lawyer, formally accused Burr of adultery and other charges. Hamilton won the case. And Burr died, by the way, the day that the divorce became final. Next slide, please. Then Eliza, age 91, moved to Washington, D.C. in 1848 to live with her daughter, Eliza Hamilton Holly. Next slide, please. And she lived on H Street, ABCDFG H Street, near Dolly Madison. They became good friends. Dolly Madison, of course, was the established prima donna of Washington, D.C. society. And Eliza and she became quite good friends and decided to raise money for the construction of the Washington Monument. Next slide, please. and celebrated its dedication on July 4th, 1848. Of course, the monument wasn't completely finished then. It was the dedication to the founding of it and the beginning of it, but it took a lot of years before the entire project was finished. Next slide, please. President Millard Fillmore called upon 96-year-old Eliza on New Year's Day in 1853. She received many, many important people in her home in her dotage in Washington. He invited her to dine at the White House, and the date he picked was the annual Washington's birthday dinner in February. Next slide, please. She appeared at the doorway. Abigail Powers Fillmore, the president's wife, a first lady, got up from her chair next to her husband, walked to the entry to the room, and escorted with guards Eliza to her own seat and seated her next to Millard Fillmore. Next slide, please. Now, her husband, of course, died much before she, and a monument was erected by the Society of the Cincinnati atop the grave of Alexander Hamilton at Trinity Church, Broadway, and Wall Street, New York City. And of course, many of you may have been there to see it, but I hope you've also been to look at the grave of Eliza right next to it. Next slide, please. And this says, firstly, she was the daughter of Philip Schuyler. Secondly, the wife of Alexander Hamilton, which I found interesting. Excuse me while I take a drink of water. Well worth visiting both graves, and the Haas Society always has commemorations there at least once a year at Trinity Church. Next slide, please. Eliza's sixth son, John Church Hamilton, completed another cherished project 7 years after her death at age 97, a biography of Alexander Hamilton. Next slide, please. And he's still on the $10 bill, in large part due to the work of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, and Lin-Manuel Miranda's play Hamilton very much helped do that too. Next slide, please. This is a quote from the Ron Chernow book on Hamilton. 79 years spent living, and 44 of these endured as a widow, racing against history and time. 10 presidents come and gone, too many compatriots to number, all laid to rest, leaving her the last of a dying age. And even to her final days, one husband she was determined the world would remember, no matter what. Next slide, please. I put up here a book, some things I recommend to you. Michael Newton's book on discovering Hamilton, the latest book in 2019, New Discoveries in the Lives, which talks about his birth year being 1754. Not 1757, and historians are having a wonderful time debating whether that is true or not. I happen to think it's true because Newton's book is quite convincing. Then I'm putting in here a nonfiction book by Tila J. Mazzeo, published in 2018, Eliza Hamilton, Extraordinary Life and Times of the Wife of Alexander Hamilton. It's very accurate in many ways on the history of Eliza, the events that took place. The one thing that many historians argue about is that she thinks, and I'm glad you're sitting down, she thinks that Eliza and Alexander were in cahoots with the story of Maria Reynolds to take everybody's attention from financial misdealings. I don't agree with that. Many historians disagree with that, but you might like to read it anyway, because it's an interesting book on the life of Eliza. Then, of course, there's a fiction book, a historical fiction that was recommended highly by a group of readers here from the Emma Clark Library. The Emma Clark Library in Stony Brook, Setauket, New York. The book club there was reading this and they recommended it highly, so I thought I'd put it up. Then, of course, we have the way you can reach the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society and my own name, which is, of course, my whole middle name, Elizabeth Kahn Kaplan @gmail.com. I thank you so much. And now I'll be glad to take any questions. Would you go on to the last slide, Nicole, please? There we go. So any questions, I'd be happy to deal with as best I can.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Well, there's a lot of rolling not questions, but just congratulations and thank you for the amount of detail was so enjoyed and just the overview of Eliza and Hamilton's relationship. Let's see, we do have just a fun question to start things off. What is you mentioned many historic sites related to both Eliza and Hamilton. What is your favorite site that you visited from either of their lives?
Well, the Grange, because it was their own home, and the Hamilton Holly house, of course, because she did live there for quite a while, and it's still standing there as thanks to the Landmarks Preservation Society. And of course, in New Jersey, Morristown, and the home where she and Alexander met, and going up to the Schuyler Mansion and being in the room where they married. You know, it's like saying, who's your favorite child? I have all of those places, and I recommend all of them to you to visit.
Thank you. We do welcome any questions in the chat. You can either send to me directly or you can send to the group. We do have another question here. You mentioned how for James Reynolds that he paid around $1,300 in total. And what's interesting is that a lot of people don't realize that his total salary as Secretary of the Treasury in a year was around 2,500. So just
Thank you.
showing how
Yes.
exorbitant that money is that he
It was.
paid in these bribes.
Yes.
It's quite amazing.
Some people say that when he stepped down as Secretary of the Treasury, it was because he really needed to earn more money. He wasn't getting paid enough. He could get more as a lawyer in New York. Nick, yeah, any other questions or comments?
Yes, we do have a question. How long did that Hamilton Free School last?
The Hamilton, oh, you know, that's an excellent question. And I wish I knew the answer to that. I'm afraid I don't know the answer. Anybody on the Zoom who can answer that, please do.
If I'm remembering correctly, I think eventually it became it lived on in various iterations, and today it continues to be a scholarship fund for students to Columbia University through, I think, the Dyckman Institute, something with Dyckman. So if my memory serves, it
Thank you for
still
that.
exists in a different form today, but continuing to help students.
Thank you. Thank you. I will go on to research that in more detail, but I appreciate that, Nicole. Now you know why she's president of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society. There isn't a single thing she can't answer in great detail and accurately.
We have a great question here from Faith. Is there a Hamilton tour if I were to visit New York City?
There is a George Washington Alexander Hamilton tour being given by another organization very soon, and I don't have the date in front of me. I just received an email invitation to take it, so that's how I know there is one. But if you'll just Google Alexander Hamilton, George Washington Walking Tour, New York City, March, April 2023, I'm sure it'll come up.
And there's several wonderful tour operators that we've partnered with over the years. So there's several we could recommend. And then also, if you're just looking more for self-guided, I actually helped contribute to a book by Brian Barreras called Where Was the Room Where It Happened? So taking sites that were featured in the narrative from the Hamilton musical, and it's really a wonderful pocket guide that not only shares historical information, how it fit into the musical, but also how to get there, how to visit, things like that. So that's a really wonderful option too. So you can sort of pick and choose what sites you might like to visit uptown and downtown when you come to New York City, and then beyond New York City as well. There's some additional chapters that talk about other cities that Hamilton spent a lot of time in. Just again, a lot of wonderful congratulations to you, Elizabeth, for your presentation. And just scrolling through, we have a question here. You mentioned that Eliza offered for Anne Lighton to come to stay with her at the Grange. Did she actually end up staying at the Grange?
Did I mention that she offered for her to stay at the Grange? She visited at the Grange. She did stay for brief periods of time. She never lived there full time.
Great. And what are your thoughts regarding the relationship between Alexander and Angelica?
I knew there'd be that question because it's one that people love to write about, not only because in Hamilton, the musical, it seems that Angelica has her eyes set on Hamilton much more than he does on her. As I mentioned before, she was married when she met him. She was a mother when she met him. She was a flirt with many people. Thomas Jefferson and she in France had a flirtatious relationship. Benjamin Franklin and she in France had a flirtatious relationship. She lived in France for a good part of her married life, came back to New York intermittently for short visits, rarely to Eliza and the family there, and spent most of her time in London and in Paris. And the letters were truly affectionate. If we wrote those letters today, you would say get married already, but that was the style of writing in the 18th century, to be effusive with romantic words, even with people that you weren't exactly going to have an affair with. For instance, Burr and Hamilton signed their letters with great, not affection, but with great respect, even when they were furious at each other and about to engage in a duel. Your humble servant and your, all that was just common in those days. So I don't think Angelica and Alexander had an affair. More intelligently, you might think of Peggy and Alexander. He was with her when she died. Alexander often went up to Albany to see the Schuylers, and Rensselaerwick, Peggy's home with her husband, Stephen, was nearby. So he often dropped in on Peggy. They were very affectionate with each other with letters. Peggy had encouraged Eliza to marry him and thought highly of Alexander. I think she spoke highly of him to her parents when there was a debate as to whether Eliza and Hamilton should really marry. Angelica is a piece of work in many ways. And if you read about her closely, you might agree with me.
Well, I think you make a great point that it was both in the personalities of Angelica and Alexander to be very flirty. And I think it's really one of the roles of historians to bring context to these short excerpts that are brought and quoted, right? Because if you hear these very florid things that are shared between the two, what someone might not realize is in that same letter, Eliza is writing a postscript saying how much we miss you, and so she's clearly not only reading the letters from Angelica, but also reading what Hamilton is writing back, and not only including her own thoughts, but sort of echoing what Alexander says by saying, please come back. And so when they were in the same city, they were very, very close. And so the sisters had an extremely close relationship throughout their lives. So it's just
Yes.
always good to have this extra context when you're debating what happened off the written record.
Angelica was the name given to Eliza's first daughter, which tells you that they were extremely close. The middle name Church, which was Angelica's married name, was given to one of her sons. So the relationship between Eliza and Hamilton and Angelica and her husband was close, but not, well, shall I say, not intimately close.
Well, we do have a question here about did the Society of Cincinnati pay for Hamilton's tombstone at the Trinity Church graveyard? I believe that the Society of Cincinnati paid for a bust and a plaque that lives within Trinity Church on the inside. But I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Elizabeth, that the outside was actually funded by Trinity. I think it says on the plaque there that it's from Trinity itself, but you might know more.
No, your knowledge about this is impeccable. I know that you and the AHA Society work closely with Trinity Church every year, or sometimes twice a year, to have a gathering at Trinity Church in honor of Hamilton's birth, sometimes of his death date. And so I'm sure that you're correct.
And we've also recognized Eliza as well on some of her anniversaries there. It's hopefully we'll have you all join us in July for our next gathering at Hamilton's final resting place at Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan, New York City.
Yeah,
We did
and
have a question. Oh, go ahead.
The graveyard also has the grave of Hercules Mulligan, who appears prominently in the play Hamilton, but also was quite a friend to Hamilton his whole life. And you might want to stop and pay respects to that as well.
Wonderful. You had mentioned Angelica. There's a question here. Do you have any good Angelica references or resources?
Only the ones that I've given you, really. I don't have an extra one for her. Perhaps Nicole does.
You know, I tend to go, the AHA Society is very into primary source documents. So I tend to spend most of my time on Founders Online, which is run by the US Archives. And so I've read a lot of her letters, not only, as you said, to Hamilton, but to others like Jefferson. So if you want to know these individuals, it's sometimes more exciting to read their own words in their entirety and really start getting a sense of their personality, their wit, their humor. So I'm not aware of really any full biographies on her, but certainly her letters are a great way to start.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I know there are many historians here because we've all invited them, right, Nicole? I've invited some, you've invited many. Certainly members of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society are interested in history, and I urge everybody on this call, on this Zoom, to become a member because you'll learn a great deal, have a lot of fun, and meet very interesting people, past and present.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And Douglas Hamilton is clarifying that the Society of Cincinnati did have some involvement with the erection of the Hamilton Monument that's atop his grave. So thank you for the clarification, Douglas. And yes, Karen, it is Founders Online. I believe it's founders.archive.gov. But if you just do a Google search for Founders Online, you can search through tens of thousands of letters between the founding generation, both in the Revolutionary War period, the prior to that, the constitutional period and beyond. It's really quite remarkable. And so thank you so much for all of your wonderful questions here and for all of your wonderful compliments, well deserved, for Elizabeth's presentation tonight. We're so pleased that so many of you came. And I do again echo Elizabeth, we'd love to have you as a member. Please support our organization. We do everything we can to make our events free and available to the public, but we do need your support as members. So we do welcome you to visit us, theahasociety.org. Become a member, learn about our upcoming events. And I did have a question here about when this presentation will be available. In the coming weeks or so, this will be edited and it will be published on our platforms. So YouTube, Facebook, and our website. And then it will live in perpetuity to be able to be enjoyed. And we again thank Elizabeth for her generosity in that way. With that, again, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you to all of you for being here. And on behalf of the entire board of the AHA Society, happy Women's History Month. And here's 3 cheers to Eliza for all of her incredible work and the fact that much of our knowledge about Hamilton that is able to be used for these kinds of presentations is thanks to her pioneering historic preservation. So a wonderful way to celebrate her work and her legacy in wanting to preserve her husband. So thank you all and wishing you a wonderful night.
Thank you for coming, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.